Ambassador Joe Hockey here, and he has a limited amount of time, but he is very excited to talk to you guys. And so we're going to have time for him to talk, and then you will have opportunity to ask some questions. So I am going to give you a brief description, and I give him the opportunity to oppose anything that might have been written about him, but I think it's true to form. So he is the current ambassador of Australia to the United States, former Australian politician and the member of Parliament for North Sydney from 1996 until 2015. He was the treasurer of Australia in the Abbott government from September 2013 until September 2015, when he resigned from the cabinet, having refused an alternative offer from the incoming Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. He previously served as the Minister for Human Services and Minister for Employment and Workplace Relations in the Howard government. And then it said that your parliamentary resignation triggered a 2015 North Sydney re-election where you were succeeded by Trent Zimmerman, who had previously worked for Hockey as a
Thank you.
So I can go on and on and on.
Okay. Good to see everyone. Father, thank you for having me again in college. I really appreciate that. And really, I want this to be interactive. Okay, so I'll say a bit about Australia and the relationship between Australia and the United States. And then I really want to throw it over to you, and I will be speaking quite honestly and frankly about everything from Washington and global politics through to, you know, some lessons you can learn when you're a student. Because what wasn't said in the introduction, I've been president of the student college at Sydney University, which is the biggest campus in Australia with 40,000 students, and I was the first independent president of the college, of the university. And I didn't waste a single minute when I was at university, and I hope you don't either. So that's another story. But Australia and the United States have a very deep relationship. We have much in common. We, as people, believe in freedom and democracy. We believe in shared values such as faith in our community, faith in a God, faith in each other. We are both governed by courts and legislatures that are respected and admired, and the rule of law is hugely important to us, as are the institutions that make sure the law is enforced. Now, that's not an accident of history. We both, as nations, are the bastard children of the British. You guys went to war with the British. They massively outnumbered us. And don't put this on YouTube, by the way. And as a result, you know, when you booted the British out of the United States, they had nowhere to send their prisoners. So they started sending them to Australia. And in fact, the first governor of Montana was a convict settler, free settler, you call him?
Ticket away, man.
That's right. Who was in Tasmania, which is as far as you can get before you run into ice in Antarctica. So Australia, with 40,000 years of culture from the Indigenous community, the Aboriginal community, had white settlers come along in 1788. And even then, we had a little twist of fate. You know, the French and the English were desperate to settle this country known as New Holland, the bottom of the earth, for different reasons. And so there was a race between the British under Governor Phillip and a Frenchman whose name was La Perouse. And to show you how history can move on a dime, the Englishman got there 3 days before the Frenchman. Before the Frenchman left port in France, he threw a 17-year-old boy off his ship 3 times. Because the 17-year-old boy was determined, fascinated, in fact, with this country at the far end of the earth. And La Perouse said, if you don't get off, I'm going to flog you and I'll put you in jail, but you will never get to the modern equivalent of Australia. You'll never get to New Holland. So that boy was thrown off the ship. La Perouse set sail. He arrived 3 days after the British. So he went across, had a glass of sherry, said, look, the English have beaten us, and he and his 2 ships set sail, never to be seen again. The guy that he threw off his ship back in France was Napoleon Bonaparte. It would have been a twist of history, and it would have been a significant event if La Perouse hadn't have thrown Napoleon off his boat. Why do I say that? Because no matter where you are in the world today, you can influence global events. But this is nothing new in one sense. Because 100 years ago, July the 4th next year, it was Americans and Australians that fought together side by side in World War I for the very first time. And I'm sorry to repeat the story from last night, Father, but I think it is an important story. In March of 1918, and don't forget, you know this, more Americans died in your US Civil War than every other war you fought. So you lost more men and women in the US Civil War than you did in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, every single war combined. So the scars were so deep in the United States from that Civil War that the US started to look within. And as a result, when you were forced to enter World War I, the rest of the British Empire, us, the New Zealanders, the Canadians, the Indians, we'd already lost a huge number of men. In fact, Australia in World War I, 1914, mobilised 10% of its population to go off and fight. That'd be an army of 35 million in America today. New Zealand, with a population of just 1 million, mobilised 11% of its population. Men aged between 16 and 40. Almost all of them went to war. On one night, they lost 3% of their population in France. Horrific stuff. So by 1918, we were all decimated. And the Americans said, right, we're going to join the war. And thank God you did. You mobilised 4 million men, but only had 1 million go over, but they were really inexperienced. And at that point, our Jewish general, John Monash, was asked by the British to take the key town of Hamel in western France. He said, I haven't got any troops. They're buried everywhere here. And they said, well, look, we'll lend you 10 companies of these Americans. But understand the Americans are really raw. They haven't fought, they haven't trained. He said, we'll train together. So the Australians and the Americans in March of 1918 trained together for the first time. And after a month or so, they began to really like each other. The Americans saw us as buddies, we saw them as mates. And the one thing that united all of us was we all hated the British. You know, that was a great legacy. As a result, Monash said, right, I'm ready to take the town of Hamel. And your general, General Pershing, said, hang on, we don't fight under foreign generals. That's not going to happen with the American army. So he started to pull his companies out. And this is the definition of character. The American soldiers then said, hey, listen, we're not going to abandon our Aussie buddies. And they started peeling off their American uniforms and putting on Australian uniforms. And they said, we don't leave anyone behind. So Pershing gave in. He said, righto, you can have 3 companies of American soldiers embedded with the Australians. Out of deference to the Americans, Monash delayed the attack until the 4th of July. He took the town of Hamel in 93 minutes. And it turned the First World War. So Australia is the only country on earth that has fought side by side with the United States in every single major conflict since that day. We were there throughout World War II. In fact, you had 1 million men based in Australia under the guidance of General MacArthur in order to relaunch into the Pacific. You lost 150,000 young Americans buried in the sand between Australia and Japan. But we also had heavy casualties. Again, fighting from day one. We were fighting for the same values. In Korea, we fought with you. The British weren't in Korea. The Canadians weren't in Korea. We're still in Korea. I mean, we're still there beside you. We were there in Vietnam, and we went through exactly the same thing that you did in Vietnam. The shame and embarrassment, the tragic treatment of our veterans, we went through that as well. And we still suffer the scars of that. And yes, Afghanistan, we've been there by your side for 17 years now. And Iraq, yes, we actually have the third biggest military force in Iraq today. We're on the other side of the earth, and we're there, fighting side by side, in Iraq and in Syria. And why do we do it? Well, it's values. And there's been much made of phone conversations between your president, our prime minister, and so on. But the thing that binds everyone together are these values, that we actually share our goals and our aspirations as nations. Now, I chaired the G20, which is the biggest economic forum in the world. I was the Treasurer of Australia, which is the equivalent of your Secretary of Treasury. So I knew Jack Lew, I know Steve Mnuchin. I chaired the meeting of all the finance ministers and central bank governors. I got to know most of the current world leaders, from Vladimir Putin, Prime Minister Modi, David Cameron. In fact, the current President of France was the Sherpa for the G20 that I chaired. So, it's amazing how it turns. I'd say to you that they're all human beings. Even Putin, Xi Jinping, all of them. They're human beings, and the most important part of the relationship is human interaction with each other. And the reason why they have these forums, like the President just went to for 13 days in Asia, is because it's that human interaction that prevents another World War I or another World War II or some other event occurring. And these days, they can have far more significant consequences, even greater than perhaps even those wars. So we can't stop talking and we can't stop interacting. So how's that all changed for Australia? How's it changed for you? Well, we used to be at the bottom of the earth. When you look at a map of the earth, we still are at the bottom of the earth, right? And we've got the same population as Florida in a country that is the same area as the continental United States. So when people talk about big ranches here, no, they're not big. When you talk about vast distances without seeing people, you can drive for 3 days in Australia and not see someone, right? It is a different environment. But the world is now divided into 3 time zones, and this has been the biggest change in my lifetime. When I was a kid growing up, you're thinking about trade pacts, about partnerships, who was your biggest investor. Look, today, the world is divided into 3 time zones. The Asia time zone, the European African time zone, and the American time zone. No one has shown me how you can work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, non-stop, no sleep. So the one thing that isn't going to change is that the world is divided into 3 time zones. And what you have witnessed during your lives is the biggest transformation in the most number of people in the history of humanity. And that is the emergence of the middle class in Asia. The European middle class in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th century, combined with imperialism, drove the global economy. And in the 20th century, it was the middle class in America that drove the global economy. You became the biggest economy in the world. And you lifted others along the way. In the 21st century, it's the middle class of Asia that is going to drive the global economy. Think of it today. There are about 300 million people in the middle class in Europe. There are about 300 million people in the middle class of the United States. Within 8 years, there will be 2 billion people in the middle class of Asia. 2 billion. And it has been that human interaction that has changed the course of history. When China decided to break down its barriers, to enter into trade with the rest of the world, we saw the greatest alleviation of poverty in the history of humanity. Hundreds of millions of people went from having an income of less than $2 a day to actually having food, electricity, walls on their homes. And now, the same is occurring in India and Indonesia. India with 1.3 billion people, China with 1.5 billion people, Indonesia with 300 million people, Vietnam, potentially 200 million people. All the tide is lifting and all boats are rising. That is going to be driving opportunities for you into the future. But the one thing the middle class of Asia wants is what you have. They want clean air. They want food that they can trust is not poisoned. And you might think, well, that's crazy. Actually, when they found that there was milk powder formula for children poisoned in China, it almost created a revolution in modern China. And Chinese will still not buy Chinese milk, which has been a great boom for New Zealand in particular and a few others. So they want bigger homes, they want better education. China has the biggest demographic bubble in the history of humanity. You know how they had a one-child policy? Well, that means that parents are getting older and there's one child that is there to support them. That child has to be educated. That child has to earn enough money to be able to take care of their parents because there's no welfare system in China. So it's a huge demographic bubble when a huge chunk of Chinese are getting older and they haven't got young people to replace them. Japan, another massive demographic bubble, a country that had 150 million people and it's falling to 80 million people. It refuses to have any immigration. And because of the nature of progressive societies, their birth rate was falling, with a net result that there are more nappies sold today for adults than there are for children in Japan. It's really crazy stuff. And these demographic bubbles are changing what our world will look like. I went to Microsoft in Seattle and spent a bit of time with Microsoft and Amazon in Seattle. And it was a potpourri of the world in those buildings. So mobility of people, mobility of education, mobility of capital, and mobility of knowledge, transforming the world. That's exciting for us at the bottom of the earth. It's exciting for you because you have more job opportunities than I ever had a few years ago, and certainly more than your parents and grandparents ever had as well. So that's a bit of an overview about where the world is heading. I mean, there's many other different angles I can talk about. I'm happy to take questions on Washington, on politics generally, on anything you like, and hopefully I'll give you the answers that you'll appreciate, but if you don't, tough. So, over to you. Yes, sir.
How do you feel about trout?
Can I get a glass of water, please? My view is that at the end of the day, I really respect your democracy. There's a safety valve in the American system. And I'm worried about the massive divide in America at the moment, which is primarily based on education. I mean, if you look at the results from the last election, with one exception I can remember, basically the states with the highest level of university education all voted Democrat, and the states with the lowest level of university education voted Republican. And the divide between the Republican vote in regional and rural areas and the Democrat vote in the cities was stark. And the divide in America between rich and poor is greater than it last got close to this in 1927. And frankly, people wanted to vent. I called the election So I first met the Trump administration, I first met Donald Trump when he was a candidate in March last year, well before he'd even won the Republican vote. I met with his staff. He only had 2 key staff at that time. I met with them. I was the first ambassador. They said, "Why are you meeting with me?" I said, "Well, because I think you may win." And they say, "Why do you think that?" And I said, "Well, I spent 20 years in politics. I can read the leaves." You know, whether I'm pretty sure you're going to win the Republican nomination. I don't know about the election yet. And a week out from the election, I said publicly in Australia that I thought there was a real chance Donald Trump would win the election. And I said to the Prime Minister, he will win. Because there's just this silent view in America that is not being reflected in the political dialogue. So I'm a bit dispassionate about, I try my best as a professional not to form judgment on individual tweets or statements, or I'm doing my best. I'm looking at why it happened and could it happen again. And my view is, as of this day, if there were an election tomorrow in the United States, thank you, Donald Trump would win. I said I'd be honest, there you go. That doesn't mean I'm a Republican backer or a Democrat. It is an observation.
Can you talk about China, the relationship you have as a country with China now and in the future?
Sure. China wants to be recognised as a global power. It's the second biggest economy in the world. It's got the biggest population in the world. I mean, its scale is just beyond belief in many ways. And I'll give you one example. I went to China in 2007 as a minister. Met with the mayor of Shanghai, who's one of the most powerful people in China. And there's a room in Shanghai, and they've got a huge glass floor, 4 times the size of this room. And underneath it is a model of the city of Shanghai. And he said, "What do you think?" I said, "Well, this is hugely impressive." But I said, "Let me get it right. You guys have just joined the World Trade Organization. So there is going to be this massive consolidation of farms in China. There was a lot of 1-acre subsistent farms. And so the latest data I read is that there are going to be 150 million people want to try and move into Shanghai." He said, "Yeah." I said, 150 million into one city? He said, "Yeah." I said, "What's the population of Greater Shanghai at the moment?" He said, 26 million. I said, "Where are you going to put 150 million people?" He said, "Well, we've thought a lot about that. And within 500 to 600 miles, we have 13 satellite cities around Shanghai." And I said, "Do you need to build them from scratch?" He said, "No, each of them already has 3 million people in them." Now, the scale is beyond the comprehension of people. The massive scale of China. And China wants to be recognised and not humiliated. And so, you know, the biggest fear of Beijing is that their people will have a falling standard of living. In America, in Australia, and other countries, we're used to, tragically, occasional recessions or depressions, high unemployment. China will not cop that. Every day in China there are riots, never reported in the media, in all different parts of China. And the one thing the government of China will never let happen is that there is a downturn that costs people jobs. Because there's no welfare, there's no safety net. And philanthropy is not really something that's recognised over there. So they have to succeed. And if China doesn't succeed, oh my God, the cost is enormous. The cost is enormous to the whole world. Yes, sir.
So currently, like with Montana specifically in Australia, there's relationships specifically with like mining and manufacturing. So on your trip here, has there been any kind of concrete or specific plans moving forward on how to like strengthen our relationships?
Well, I'm having dinner with the governor tonight and drinks with the lieutenant governor, as you call him, sorry, lieutenant. here. And I went out to a cattle property this morning. I can't claim to be an expert on Montana after that. I have to go back to Washington tomorrow. But you know, there is a lot of opportunity in agriculture, mining. I mean, you've got a lot of coal mining here. We're the biggest coal exporter in the world. We also have agricultural practices that might work here. I mean, the Black Angus cattle that you have here, we have them as well. They're not, our Black Angus aren't used to the weather that you have here. But you know, the exchange of you know, some higher tech agricultural initiatives really works. And from a manufacturing perspective, Australia is a very high-end our manufacturing sector has decreased. We've stopped making motor vehicles in Australia. We stopped. It was a big decision, but we just can't compete. So we've gone higher end, like, you know, I don't know if any of you have heard of cochlear hearing aids, but for essentially deaf people, we invented a hearing aid that can give them back their hearing, which is transformative stuff. And in pharmaceuticals, Carroll and a whole range of other drugs originated in Australia. So there's ways that we can develop it. I want to get to know Steve Bullock. I want to get to know, you know, we call it the cut of his jib. Yeah. Tell me about yourselves. I mean, I know you're desperate to get out, but is there anything, you know? Yes, yeah.
Where's Australia in terms of energy? You talked about them being the largest exporter of coal. Montana's a big coal, but we're also moving to solar.
Yeah.
You've got a big desert there.
Yeah. You can have some of it if you want.
So where's Australia in terms of
Yeah.
energy policy?
So we are the biggest exporter of coal in the world. I mean, there are bigger producers. The United States is the biggest producer of coal in the world, but it uses it itself. China's a big producer of coal, but it's really dirty coal, brown coal, with really high emissions and low quality. Indonesia's a big exporter of coal, but we're the biggest, and our coal is of a better quality. So it means that you get more energy out of each tonne of our coal. And you know, India still has maybe 300 million homes with no electricity. China still has homes with no electricity. In fact, vast chunks of Asia have places with no electricity. And you can't provide that base load power with renewable energy. You actually do need to have coal. So coal will continue to be used, and particularly in Asia, but everyone's looking for alternatives. So the most obvious alternative is liquid natural gas, and we are about to pass Qatar as the biggest exporter of LNG in the world. We couldn't do it without investment from the United States. So ExxonMobil and Chevron and ConocoPhillips are the biggest. They've spent combined $150 billion building out LNG, which is accessible to Asia. So the cost of getting LNG from here or things from here to Asia is just prohibitive in one sense. So they've massively invested in Australia. We're now this year going to pass Qatar as the biggest exporter of LNG. We have the biggest reserves of uranium in the world, and you're our biggest customer, the United States. But one thing about uranium, which is, you know, we're working through, is we feel that we have a responsibility if we mine it and we export it for use, that we should also return it back to the earth. So we are looking at building the only uranium depository in the world. So it will, you know, we've got a part of that big desert. We're digging an almighty tunnel where you can put it down there and uranium that has been used, because at the moment it's stored in all sorts of different places, which is unstable. So we're quite prepared to look at having the place on Earth where it's sent back. So we're a big exporter of energy into Asia. We're the biggest exporter of iron ore into Asia, biggest exporter of iron ore in the world, and copper and a few other things as well. But all of that's just 9% of our economy. 2% of our jobs. And agriculture, which we're famous for, and we're a big exporter in agriculture, that's just 2% of our economy. So we've had to really diversify, and Australia hasn't had a recession for 26 years. So we haven't had high unemployment for 26 years. But it's because we, you know, when the internet age came, we didn't throw all our eggs in that basket. When mining and resources were in demand, we didn't throw all our eggs in that basket. We were able to get the balance a bit right, combined with massive development out of Asia. Yes, ma'am.
What percentage of Australia's economy would be a service economy?
70%. So education's huge. And there's a big opportunity for you guys if you want to study in Australia. Might even be cheaper than here. I don't know. But it's, given that you've got a strong dollar. So we have 500,000 foreign students studying in Australia. And the biggest cohort are Indians, followed by Chinese, followed by, we have, I think there's about 40 or 50,000 Americans studying in Australia. So education's big. Tourism is very big. If you have a chance, and because you're students and you get a little bit more time than you might when you go into the workforce, can I urge you to go and visit Australia? Go and backpack. You get the chance to work there too. If you want, working holidays there are, you know, you'll have the best time of your life. So tourism's very big. Also health. 13% of our economy is healthcare. We're starting to export a lot into Asia, from cosmetic surgery to dental surgery. They come down to Australia to get their operations. That's a huge growth area, massive. And, you know, the arts and culture. I mean, I can't say to you enough how important it is to integrate your learnings in the arts into everything you do in your career. You know, just, it really, I think it's going to become more and more a key part of the future of the world, how we integrate our culture and our arts into our everyday way of life. And that's what a lot of tech companies are trying to do. You know, how they have more unique identifiers as part of their product range. Yes, ma'am.
Has the deterioration of the Great Barrier Reef affected tourism at all?
No, it hasn't affected tourism. Part of it is unquestionably climate change.
Mm-hmm.
Part of it is we have cyclones up there that hit the reef, which is like your hurricanes that really shake it up. Part of it is, you know, we had these starfish that, you know, are like vultures on the reef. But we have a really intense reef. The Great Barrier Reef is, 1,200 miles long. It's the biggest living organism in the world. And parts of it get hit up here and other parts are doing really well. And plus we have on the other side of the country a reef that is probably, you know, 400 miles long, which is amazing that no one ever visits. So, or not no one, but people rarely visit, with what we call whale sharks. Whale sharks the size of this room, and they eat plankton, and you can swim with them. They're bigger than this room actually, they're bloody monsters. And so what we have is a plan where tourists can only go to certain parts of the Great Barrier Reef, and then we rotate it so it can regrow and revegetate. And there's a university up there called James Cook University if you're interested in environmental science. In fact, we know a number of Americans that have gone there for a month or 2 months or 6 months to study a course in environmental science right on the Great Barrier Reef. And it's really interesting. It's a really interesting course. Yes, ma'am.
What are some general stereotypes that Australians have towards Americans, and how do you think they're true or not?
Well, I grew up with things that you probably don't even remember, like the Brady Bunch, McHale's Navy and Hogan's Heroes and Magnum PI. And, you know, I'm still a big KC and the Sunshine fan fan. And, you know, America is the only global empire in the history of humanity that hasn't had to invade other countries in order to share your values. Now, I was thinking about this the other day. I was in Israel walking around, in Jerusalem and various other places, and the Romans invaded other countries to expand Roman culture. The Greeks did. The British did with the British Empire, the biggest empire in the history of humanity. The French, the Portuguese, the Spanish. They all invaded, and they were brutal imperial powers. But you know what? And the Soviet Union did that, Russia. But the United States hasn't done that. In fact, you have had to be dragged into a global leadership position. I mean, you're like the reluctant participant. You are the reluctant world leader, even today. And it pees me off, even today. The president is saying America first. Actually, that's another example of, hang on, we don't want to lead the world. And yet, you're the only country where everyone wants to sign up and be an ally. And it's not because you're the biggest military power in the world, it's because of your values. Vietnam was napalmed by America 40 years ago. Vietnam is desperate to have you as an ally ahead of China. And it was the Chinese that helped to save Vietnam from the Americans and the Australians. And yet they want to sign up to you because they want your values of freedom and enterprise and community and ambition and innovation. That's what the rest of the world wants, based on a rule of law. That's what they want, and you guys have it. And so part of the way that you've got that across is through your culture. Hollywood is the best soft diplomacy I have ever seen. I mean, I've been to the most remote parts of the world, and someone in the most remote part of the world will say that he wants to meet Luke Skywalker, or, he's never seen Star Wars. I mean, 100 miles up into the hills of Papua New Guinea, where some people are still eating each other, right? They've never seen a television, and yet they've heard of American culture. And that's because, that's what people want. They want freedom, and you represent freedom. So there can be the perception that Americans are loud, that they're wealthy. In fact, I'll tell you, there's a great line. During World War II, when all of our troops were off fighting in Europe and the Middle East, there were 1 million Americans that made Australia their home, soldiers, ready to fight. And there was a great resentment in Australia from the blokes because the American soldiers came over, and as they said at the time, they're oversexed, overpaid and over here, right? And they wanted them to go back, right? 60,000 Australian women ended up marrying the Americans and heading back to them. So you can imagine these poor guys come back from war and find that all the women have said, oh, those Americans, they're fantastic. I love those Americans. Why aren't you more like an American GI? Yeah, all right. So that went well. But at the end of the day, and you know what? That's part of the rest of the world admires this so much, that they're very tolerant and very aware of what's happening in US politics and going, okay, well, you guys sort it out. You have to. Because the cost of the world of not sorting it out is far greater than anything could be imagined. Yes, sir.
I remember reading somewhere that, speaking of values, freedom of speech is definitely one that Australia values significantly, but in your constitution, there isn't an actual, there's no amendments that are actually defending.
Good point.
Do you think that Australia should make an amendment, to defend freedom of speech, or?
Well, this is the thing. As soon as you codify something, the question is whether that, in fact, will withstand the test of time. Now, freedom of speech is essential, but there's no argument about freedom of speech in Australia. But you look at your gun laws. Some would say, well, they were suited for a different time. But they were written, they're enduring. Well, Australia doesn't have... we don't have a Bill of Rights. We haven't codified the rights of people, but our institutions are set up to protect the rights of people. And there are moments when that is tested, and we, like you, have an independent Supreme Court. We call it the High Court. And the High Court interprets it to the letter, the Constitution. I'll give you one example, which is really, it's a big issue in Australia at the moment. The Constitution says you have to be an Australian citizen, and only an Australian citizen, to be elected to Parliament. So what's happened is a whole lot of Australian members of Parliament have discovered that their father or their mother never renounced their British citizenship, their New Zealand citizenship, their Hungarian citizenship, whatever the case. Therefore, they automatically, as the child of a citizen of another country, inherited that citizenship. So automatically they're disqualified from Parliament. Now they're falling like 10 pins in Australia. And they didn't know. And it's anachronistic in this day and age that you say, a quarter of our country was born overseas. We have a huge immigration program. We've got a big refugee program. And yet that's a legacy from a constitution written in 1901. So we're pretty comfortable with the fact that we don't have a Bill of Rights. The biggest issue, in a sense, at a constitutional level, is how we properly recognise the Aboriginal population. America dealt with it in a different way in relation to Native Americans, but we've struggled with it in Australia, and it's a weakness we have. Yeah. Sure, you get another one. I'll finish soon. Yep.
Would you mind telling us how you decided to come here to Montana? I mean, you're a globetrotting ambassador, but here you are here. You mind sharing a little bit of that?
Well, it's not that complicated. I was in Los Angeles speaking at the Mike Milken Institute at the Milken Conference, and I ran into your governor at a drinks. He was giving a speech, and I just started chatting to him. And to be honest, I thought he's the sort of person that would make a great candidate for president. And I walked out and I thought about it, and then I saw a bit more speculation. And I thought, God, I should go over and have a look at Montana and get to see the place and get to know him a bit better. It's a very honest answer. There is the danger for the rest of the world is that America is seen as Hollywood and New York. I think that's a big risk. And I've really made an effort since I've been here to get beyond that beltway. I think it's pretty unreal in many ways. And, Montana embodies a lot of good values that are very similar to Australia. I mean, you have had a disproportionate amount of your people go to war fighting for America. You've got big, vast open spaces and a harsh environment. So do we. You're straight talkers. So do we. You've got big mining and resources industry. So do we. And, you care about the environment. You care about a whole lot of other good things, and so do we. So I thought that was a good starting point. Don't tell anyone in the other states. Okay. Yes, sir.
With the amount of Chinese investment that's headed to sub-Saharan Africa right now, do you see that changing Australia's relationship with those countries as well?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the coup in Zimbabwe is a really interesting development. I backpacked when I was a student, your age. I went and backpacked South Africa and Zimbabwe. So I had a 3-month break, and I put on a backpack with my best friend, and we went South Africa. And this is the beauty of getting out. You never know what you discover. So I was there in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was released from jail. I was standing outside the jail as he walked free. I went to a extreme right wing white rally in Pretoria by the AWB, headed by Eugene de Blanche, which was the most frightening thing I've ever done. And I worked on a farm for a white soldier in Zimbabwe, and he was subsequently murdered by Mugabe and his regime. So, and at that time, Zimbabwe was was the interesting pro-Western country, and South Africa was the home of apartheid. And they flipped. And part of that was, and because of their vulnerability, China, which only wants to guarantee its resources, goes into Zimbabwe, buys mines, buys 100,000 working visas, and has huge investments. But the thing is, Chinese investment, like American investment, doesn't necessarily own the politics of the country. I mean, Tanzania is another good example. I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and spent a bit of time in Tanzania. And I've got to tell you, it's, the amount of money there that has come from China has been very significant, but it hasn't bought the foreign policy of Tanzania. I mean, they might be more tempered, but you can't buy someone's foreign policy. The only way you can do it is share values. And no matter what money is spent by some countries, if you've got shared values, you do well. And I think that applies in sub-Saharan Africa as well, but maybe not as much as it should. Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for coming along.